You're listening to Beyond the Endpoint, a podcast from the Duke Clinical Research Institute. In this series, we're demystifying clinical research and answering your pressing questions about health and healthcare. You can find our full episodes at dcri.org/BTE.
What do clinical research and championship teams have in common? It's all about strategy, agility, and putting people at the center of the game. In our season finale of Beyond the Endpoint, we're taking a look at clinical research through a sports lens, and you won't want to miss the play-by-play. I'm Manesh Patel, and I'm here with my co-host, Emily O'Brien, who's going to introduce our special guest today.
Hey, thanks so much, Manesh. So joining us today to break it all down is Dr. Adrian Hernandez, the Executive Director of the Duke Clinical Research Institute, Vice Dean and Professor in the Duke School of Medicine, a practicing cardiologist, and a lifelong sports fan. So today we're going to discuss the current state of clinical research, where we go from here, and how we as researchers and clinicians can stay grounded with a patient-centered approach. And we're going to approach the conversation through a sports-based lens because we're always trying to get on Adrian's good side. Adrian's going to help us today understand what it takes to build and lead a strong research ecosystem in a constantly shifting landscape, and why staying focused on teamwork, trust, and long-term goals is key to delivering real-world impact. Adrian, thanks so much for being with us today.
Hey, thanks for having me on, and really looking forward to the discussion here and being part of the team.
One of the questions that comes to mind for me is, we're at Duke, there's a lot of conversations around basketball. We have some one and dones. I might call you a one and done because I know in fellowship you took a lot shorter to finish than I did. I had to stay a few extra years probably to learn some things. So you were more like a star player, a one and done. But if our clinical research enterprise today was a basketball team, what would it be? Are we rebuilding with young talent? Are we requiring more contenders, more work? What are the challenges you see in actually doing clinical research today?
Yeah, so Manesh, thanks for bringing back the early days when we were rookies together, starting fellowship and figuring our way in terms of cardiology and how we wanted to make a difference in research. And I think both of us have witnessed how important it is to have great teams and also to adjust to the moment or change at pivotal moments that we're in right now. And so, like you and others are very proud of Duke's traditions, especially in basketball. And Duke is very well known in terms of basketball dynasties, but also known in terms of how the game has to change or how the game changes how you recruit, how you develop teams, and how you execute. And certainly we're seeing that in clinical research right now.
So you mentioned change. I think it's an understatement to say that this is a period of massive transformation. And not just this year. I mean, certainly over the past decade or two, we've seen incredible growth of things like electronic health records, embedded pragmatic trials, decentralized trials. As you sort of think back over that period, what would you say is the most exciting game changer that you've seen? And how do you think DCRI is using that to stay ahead of the curve?
You know, if you look back in history, there are times where there are pivots, that there are major changes that happen that open up. Using the sports analogy you said is that, you know, when things changed in terms of how players were recruited and retained, there were aspirations, what their goals were, and how NIL became a real factor. And teams that embrace that change have been more successful. And likewise, you know, we're seeing the same thing for clinical research. For us, in terms of pivotal moments, certainly it's been the evolution of going digital. And so every process that we had years ago were literally on paper, things that took place by fax. And now you can't even imagine having that. In the same way, actually about 10 years ago, DCRI really launched the largest and first ever decentralized trial, reaching potential participants at their home and leveraging electronic health records before it was really called a decentralized trial. And that trial was called Adaptable. And it was noted to be adaptable by name. One, it was adapting to a new environment. And two, actually our patient partners named it that way because they knew that we had to adapt into their world, a new environment. And so it had multiple meanings, and see that as kind of a pivotal moment, changing clinical trials and how they're done. I think likewise, we're in the same state of affairs right now because of all the external environment that's changing upon us every day.
Yeah, Adrian, I think that was a great example, and it speaks to part of the pride people take in doing the work they do. And one of the, I think, values of, we're sort of using this sports analogy, but just one of the values of being on a team where people feel like you're making a difference in both the clinical world and the research world and the information we get. And I think some of that comes from some of those types of really innovative things we've done. Are there things you can think of in our past that are going to be important as we look forward? We're getting digital, we're doing decentralized, but even the founding of the DCRI itself, if you will, doing large, simple trials was innovative at that time to change and answer questions. How do you see that going forward? What are the adjustments you see coming forward? What historical things can teach us about our next half of play, or what we need to do coming up?
Well, if you think about the founding of DCRI, and also just I'll say one of the things that's been emblematic of Duke is that at the very beginning, it's been about the patients. Someone had a health problem, a dilemma that we knew there needed to be a better answer for the next person like that. That started off with the Duke Data Bank for cardiovascular disease, the first computerized textbook of medicine, really, back in the 1960s. And then if you fast forward to today, it's still the same set of issues of big problems to solve. The patient in front of us, where we're trying to address a health problem, we're actually trying to do something to prevent a health problem. But now we're trying to do it at scale. That's not just one person, but doing it at a scale that's in the thousands or millions. And so just thinking about North Carolina, if we could do something even faster and better for 10 million people in North Carolina, I feel like that is going to be where we need to be going in the future. And so everyone can be part of the research process or get the answers immediately from the research process. And so that's my hope for the future.
Yeah, it's going to be super interesting to see how all the various institutions, including our own, sort of make these halftime adjustments, so to speak, to adapt to this environment as we've been discussing. It strikes me, as I think about everything that we've talked about and sort of considered as faculty over the past several months in this sort of new era, it's more than just a halftime adjustment. It's almost like we went to the locker room and came out and like the rules were different. The 3-point line is somewhere else. There's no more referees, different changes that we're having to deal with. And in some ways, it's like learning to play like a new sport. Is that how it feels to you? And how are you kind of leading in this very uncertain time?
I think in some cases, it's a completely different game. So the expectations are to be faster, be better, be cheaper. So how can we do things in a better way? The second thing is actually being more person-centered. So meeting people where they're at. Right now, most research has a one size fits all. And the example of that is just the informed consent process. We have one form that is supposed to be used for every potential participant in a trial. And so it is being used in a kind of a least common denominator way. So imagine having a team that only had one play. What team would be successful in the sport? No teams will be. And so a lot of our research processes are one size fits all, and it's not necessarily taking advantage of the context, how things vary, how to be more personalized, be more person-centered, more adaptable, and also taking advantage of the technologies that are evolving rapidly all around us. So that needs to happen. Otherwise, we won't have a dynasty.
Adrian, I think your points are good because often what I know you and I have had these conversations. We have this with our clinicians, our researchers, our patients, everyone. I mean, in times of challenge, you have to get even better. It's without question that we could do better for the health of our country and our communities. And how we do that is taking lessons that we see in the clinic to the research areas and research areas back to our patients. And maybe one of the questions I had is, I joke about you being a fellow with me and finishing earlier, but you have essentially been somebody that's been a leader in the DCRI, but also our faculty for a while. One of the results of that is that you help us better think about how do we lead, how do we take our practice, clinical practice, and inform our research, and how do we have our research inform our practice. in your time now as the director of the DCRI, and maybe even of your time on faculty, are there sort of lessons that you've sort of struck home that become the guiding light? Because, as you all were speaking of the game changing, I do think the game is changing, or at least the pressures are changing. But in some ways, I think the goal is still the same often.
Yeah, so one of the thing that we all try to emulate is the so-called player coach, and so I think that stems from the founder of DCRI, Rob Califf. One of the things that he did when we were fellows is that he rounded in the CCU and also the General Cardiology Service, and he kept it very real, understanding what a patient's dilemma, what a family's problem was, what are the clinical challenges that need to be addressed. And he was actually also able to bring the world of research to that room and vice versa. They carried on the tradition with Bob Harrington and others at DCRI. And so I think that's one of the key things that we've found is that being that so-called player coach, helps translate, what happens directly at a bedside or in a patient's room or in a family member that's dealing with a loved one's health problems to something that can go to scale across clinical research programs and also ultimately implementation. I think also that matters in terms of when people are talking about policy. If you can make it matter to what it's like for an individual who's experiencing some challenge, and then imagine how that goes into a much larger way where it's affecting millions, then I think we can actually tell a story from someone who's suffering a health problem to something where it can affect millions. And so I think that's one of the key things here that we've learned along the way. And I've actually seen that at other places as well. At a recent visit at another university, and the dean had been rounding in the ICU and actually sharing that experience of what it's like with the rest of his staff to actually understand what the front lines are like.
Spoken like a true population health scientist, I'll just say, moving from the individual patient encounter to the impact at the level of millions. So that's something that Rob talks about. And, we're fortunate to have him on the podcast several months ago. And as you know, he's really passionate about the issue of health disparities and the contributors of social determinants of health to some of the issues around life expectancy and quality of life that we're grappling with and that are very much in the public domain discussion these days. At the same time, when you hear our leaders at the federal level talk about the drivers of poor health outcomes, you don't hear a lot about things like social determinants of health. And I think some of the terms that we use to talk about those issues are not accepted in the way that they were before. I know this is still important to, you as a scientist and clinician, and certainly to the DCRI. So tell us how you're approaching this issue of health disparities and acknowledging that it's still important to look at those things and that pretending like they're not there doesn't make them go away. As Rob mentioned when we spoke with him, how do we maintain our integrity of these scientific fundamentals, so to speak, while embracing new expectations?
Yeah. So, I'll just say, I have witnessed it directly that there are health disparities. Where I grew up in a small town in Texas, Port Arthur, Texas, there was literally a railroad where there was one side of the track and another side, and outcomes were different. And then even more recently, a major newspaper profiled what are the challenges that are happening right now because of various research programs getting canceled that are directly aiming to address issues of health disparities. And the example that they were highlighting was actually around environmental effects that are contributing to health disparities. Now, on the front page of this article was a picture of my hometown, literally showing houses next to refineries and noting that a grant got canceled that was trying to understand that relationship, environmental pollutants, with health disparities that were happening in that neighborhood. And so that just reminded me that it's so critical for us to continue to address these issues. They're not going away. And so in some way, somehow, we have to understand them and we also have to change them. And so that's pretty fundamental for our mission.
This is Beyond the Endpoint, a podcast where we bring personal and expert perspectives on healthcare and clinical research to the casual listener. Stay tuned after the interview for a breakdown with the hosts. They'll talk through key takeaways and what this week's topic means for you.
Adrian, I think we've talked a lot about sort of, the history of the research we've done and some of the, I'll call them headwinds that we face right now with whether it's funding or just fundamentally breaking down some of these disparities in care, or at least outcomes that aren't as optimized around all of our communities. And I look to you to say, what are the things that you're seeing that start to show us strategic partnerships or innovative things we're doing that are going to change and are changing not just the health of our communities, but the way we learn from our communities, the way we do research in our communities?
Yeah. So when you have so much disruption right now, that's actually a perfect moment of change. It causes everyone to rethink how they're doing things. And so I'm hopeful that there's actually a term called AI may have a big impact. And what I mean by that is actually not artificial intelligence, but actually administrative intelligence. Over the last decade, it's been well documented that across multiple sectors, it's become more and more challenging in terms of the administrative processes, all the various checks that have to be done. And sometimes we don't necessarily take a step back and say, what's really fundamental? What can we change? That was answering a problem years ago, but maybe there's a better way to do something now. And so I think now with everyone kind of looking at their own organizations, how can we be better? How can we be more streamlined? How can we be more efficient, effective? It's actually going to open up an era of AI, of administrative intelligence. There's certainly another AI, artificial intelligence, that's gotten a lot of attention. And so I think that's also going to open up as well, that we'll have policies and practices that will enable that more. And then there's a final thing that I want to note is that through all this, we still need to have so-called HI, human interaction and human intelligence. And that still really matters when we're talking about clinical research. People are joining often a study to improve the health of everyone else, and they're being pioneers to do that. And that human interaction does require attention. And I think this is where, we will see, I'll say, going back to the future, humanistic approaches to medicine research that we haven't seen in the more recent times.
And maybe it's the privilege that you're highlighting that we have when we take care of patients and do research. And that privilege is even more evident now, because that privilege to care for people and to do research is quite meaningful. And I guess I'd follow up your question by saying, we want the human in the loop, or the human intelligence for sure, the humanistic approach. I love the administrative and the artificial intelligent conversations, because there's certainly some of those that could be used broadly. You're a big Moneyball fan, I know, because we talk about it all the time. What do you see as the trade-offs that we're going to have? Or as this disruption happens, what are some of the things that we've held on to in the past that maybe we can reduce or change or become more efficient with? Because fundamentally, that is going to be one of the things we're going to have to do.
I mean, there's certainly a lot of windmills that people can go chase after. I think the systems that really take advantage of this moment to be much more efficient and effective in terms of the research process will win the day. And so if you think about how things will become more and more competitive in terms of best use of resources, we got to focus on things that are going to be the most effective in terms of getting people engaged with research, being able to do the research that matters for the largest groups of people or the areas where there is the greatest need, or addressing issues such as rare health conditions in a much faster and a simpler way. And so I'm hopeful that we'll see simpler processes for doing so. And if we do, then it'll be an all boats rise occasion. Those places that don't, I think that they will fall behind. And at some point, they won't be as successful as they would want to be. It could be the so-called Oakland A's of the world that really changes and shows how things can be done and really outpace every other place, making it better and faster for everyone.
Just to continue with the Billy Bean line of questioning, of course, as you know, Billy was a big fan of data, and all top athletic programs seem to use cutting edge analytics and technology to at least attempt to get a competitive advantage. Can you tell us a little bit specifically about this area and what institutions like Duke are doing or should be doing to leverage technology to do things like improve the use of real world data, build on accessibility of clinical research and trials, and then to disseminate those results.
Yeah, so if you think about, just AI being applied to each step of the process, it could be very transformational. I want to highlight it's not just actually the research data that can be transformational, it's actually the before and after. All the steps that it takes to get a research program going, getting a clinical trial going. There's so many past experiences that actually are database that actually could be useful for enabling the next one to go faster. And so just thinking about contracts as an example, the negotiations that happen are relatively so-called routine in terms of top issues. They get solved in similar manners, but often with different parties each time. And then on the research conduct, we are getting smarter and smarter in terms of taking advantage of both the structured health data as well as unstructured health data, and then also incorporating data at home. If you think about our kids, they're doing this all the time right now with all the wearables that they have and their various phone activities. They're actually in school using that all the time. We need to do so in healthcare and research so we can get much faster and much better and have a more holistic understanding of someone's health.
Adrian, that's, I think, a forward-looking way of thinking about it. And one way that I've been thinking about another important area, I think about it as adoption, which is, when you engage people in communities, meeting people where they are, you're more likely, hopefully, to get broad groups of patients, diverse people from around different communities involved, so that when you have something that hopefully works, they're more likely to use it. They're more likely to believe in it. They're more likely to trust it. How do we do that going forward, given some of the challenges to just the way we're thinking about how diversity programs or programs that are trying to get diverse people into studies go?
I think one of the things is that in order to be trustworthy, we have to make sure we share all that we know, including the things that are not great. Those are lessons learned. And we need to make sure that people understand from whether it's a research result that had an unexpected finding, meaning it wasn't expected in terms of a positive benefit, but we should be sharing that widely so that everyone understands what may or may not work. In the same setting in terms of the research process, if we only share the success stories, then we won't learn from our mistakes. And so that's going to be critical as well. And again, to enable trust to continue to be earned, especially across different communities that have not been part of the research process and may be distrustful or have historically.
Yeah, this is to me such a critical moment in time for that specifically. And again, an area where you could easily look at the current state of the world and get pretty depressed about, the state of misinformation and the lack of trust in the so-called scientific establishment. At the same time, we're seeing such great involvement of people outside of the sort of day-to-day research community with research through patient-led research initiatives and advocacy. Are you hopeful that as that area grows, that we'll see better integration of our communities and that that trust will continue to build? Because to me, that's such an important table stakes for producing science that can actually translate. Because without that, if people don't believe, what's in the papers that we publish, they're unlikely to really, be part of a good shared decision making process and trust what their clinicians have to say.
I think, one of the key things is whether someone decides to join a research study or just learn about the results from it, the more that are part of the process, either being informed or actually contributing directly, the better we'll be in terms of addressing any mistrust in science. And there have been, unfortunately, a lot of examples that have eroded trust in science that we need to address. And part of it is just making sure people understand uncertainty. In the research world, we actually quantify that. We actually give a statistical test and show a range of possibilities, but we don't always translate that to the community. And so the more that we can have people engaged in research and learning what's out there or learning what a result may be, or if they were joining a study, just as if they were, can be helpful. And so hopefully we can grow the number of people who participate or at least be on the front lines in terms of learning about a result when it comes out.
Whether it's Billy Bean or Coach K, I'm going to give you a coach moment here. What are you saying to the next generation of, I'll call it, fellows, faculty, researchers? What are the ways in which we build the workforce, and what things do you think, as we get towards our closing, what are the ways we're going to inspire the people that are going to make the world better to do the kind of work that you and others do?
I think, there are a few things, but if we really want to be champions of health, then we're going to be better off if we're playing like a team that's getting a little bit better every day. And so there's a famous cardiologist that I work with. His son was a team captain of a legendary high school cross country team. And he noted that if everyone could just do a little bit better, just 1% better every week, that became exponential. And so I think for everyone who's part of the research team, whether someone's sitting in an administrative role like contracts or IRB, if we can be 1% better one week to the next, that becomes exponential. The same way in terms of recruiting participants in studies. Then also, like as people join studies, how they can inform us how to be 1% better. And so I think that has a winning game plan.
I'm going to have to tell my son when he comes home from college that you're quoting him over me on this 1% better thing. I'm glad that he had such an impact on you and your squad. I'm going to ask him if he's getting 1% better every day, although I suspect he's trying. I do think it's an important concept.
We all can have personal records, so I think that's
Yeah, I know. That's right. There's a drive that thankfully that kids fall more on mom's side than dad's, so that's probably part of what's driving this. One of the things that you've done, Adrian, but then also Emily in your department, is that it's 1% better, but then there's the sustainability of excellence, and how do you get people to realize that it's an everyday action, and what are we doing to keep that going? Adrian, I'll start with you and then end with Emily, maybe to see how she thinks about it in the pop health department too.
Well, I think one of the things that's going to come up, it seems like, is that as we start having the abilities to affect not just hundreds or thousands of people in terms of improving their health, but millions, that gets to a scalability that we've never had before. And so then it starts opening up other possibilities that we couldn't imagine before. So we're often used to models that are treating disease. Now imagine models for which we can prevent disease. And so that seems like it's a great hope that may be much closer than what we've imagined.
Emily, what are your thoughts?
When I think about sustainable excellence, certainly the thing that first comes to mind is being able to adapt and improve, and the 1% better approach that you all have discussed. To me, it also gets back to Adrian's point about lessons learned and transparency. I don't think that we've been really a shining light as a research community for quite some time in sharing, what hasn't worked and where areas of uncertainty are. And especially during the pandemic, I think that came back to bite us a little bit as we updated our knowledge about this new virus and vaccines and tried to share that. I think people felt like, oh, well, you sounded so certain and now you're kind of changing the story. I think we can help to improve that process through the partnerships that Adrian talked about, but also just being honest with people that science doesn't always have the right answer right away. It does take time, and we do make mistakes. We're willing to learn. We're willing to improve. That's a mentality that I think can certainly help us in the way that we do research, but also create an environment where people do feel more free to ask questions and sort of start that dialogue with us as scientists and as clinicians. So they feel more empowered to make good decisions about their own health and to make decisions that they can stick to. So I think that, you all probably have seen with your own kids, it's a different generation sort of coming up. They have a different view on what they share with the world that tend to be, I think, a little bit more open and more transparent about their whole selves. And so that to me is encouraging. I'm hopeful that we'll see more uptake of that in the future.
I think the hope is obviously always the people that we get to work with. And then the sustainability is excellence that I think we're blessed to see where we are, and we'll get to see in some of the people that do the kinds of research and the opportunities. Excellence is a habit, not an action. Just what people do when you're not looking. And we see people in research really wanting to make a difference in lives. And the greatest discoveries in health need to reach people where they are. And if I think about the innovations Adrian's talking about, our biggest hopeful opportunity is that we may have the scale and the opportunity soon enough to get those breakthroughs to millions of people that would be healthier. Adrian, thanks again for leading the DCRI and leading us in thinking about clinical research. You're the cleanup hitter in our podcast season 1. I think, at least off the wall. I don't know if you hit a home run, but I think you knocked it off the wall, probably a walk into second base. Thanks for joining us.
All right. Thanks for having me.
All right, Emily. I have to say, capping it with Adrian and sort of how he thinks about research is great. He's consistently giving us both a balanced view of what the challenges are, but a way forward. Did you take anything really specific out of his conversation that's going to last with you?
One of the things that I love most about working for Adrian and also, hearing him talk about the field is that he is willing to kind of challenge longstanding paradigms, but he does it in a really thoughtful way. And I think that's exactly what we need in this moment. What I really liked about kind of his roadmap, if you will, is like, it's nothing too off the wall. In some ways, it's sort of taking a close look at ourselves and saying, here's what we should have been doing all along. There are parts of ourselves, our mission that we know are core and that we want to stay true to, like engaging directly with patients to do better research and ask better questions, like making sure that disparities research is still part of our work and that we are, focused on improving diversity and access in clinical trials. But at the same time, like maybe there are areas that could use a shakeup, and he's willing to acknowledge that and to think creatively about how to do that. Administrative intelligence is a new one for me. I think our folks would probably, our DCRI community would have some thoughts about that. But it is an area of hope. I think we all want to be more efficient. So I think it's great to hear somebody who's sort of got a whole view of the system talk about how to maybe do that in a systematic and a strategic way.
Yeah, Emily, I appreciate your point. And I guess I would say a couple things too. Having known Adrian for a long time, one of the real values with him is that it's pretty unshakable. There are not going to be a lot of times you're going to get Adrian off his thought process. And again, I think like good teams, we started this with a sports analogy, and I'll just end it with one, which is really good teams, and we're going to need those working together. They have a few features people talk about all the time. The first, I think, that I mentioned in one of the other podcasts is something from Coach K, which is speed to trust. We don't spend a lot of time questioning others' motives. We know we're all trying to accomplish the same thing. If I've messed up, we're going to hold ourselves accountable, but we trust each other to try to get things done. We're pretty honest. I think that conversation's pretty honest and gets to what you're talking about. At times of challenge, you trust that we're going to get through it, and you start to get honest about what you think you need to do, which is first be honest that we could be better for our communities. We could be better for health. We could be better in how we share research. In many ways, that's the goal of the podcast. This is to sort of show people what it takes to get the information done and get it out there. What are the endpoints? What are the things we know? What are the things we don't know? What's unexpected? Because it's not perfect, but it's an effort of continual improvement to try to improve health. Because I think that's how you gain trust. You're more transparent and honest about it. And then we're inclusive. I'll just say, I've really enjoyed being able to hear your perspective. I get to hear other perspectives. We want everyone's perspective as we think about how does the world get better through doing the service of research and the purpose of making health better. So it's been fun. We look forward to having people continue to listen to us. And I just want to thank them for listening and thank you for being the co-host. Getting to see the world through your perspective has helped me think about what we do.
Well, thanks so much, Manesh. I'll say Adrian has a true learning mindset, and that I think is exactly what we're hoping to embody with the podcast, is to continue to learn, continue to challenge ourselves, and to learn from our listeners as well. So we're so grateful to everyone for tuning in, and we really can't wait to see you for next season.
This has been Beyond the Endpoint. Resources related to this episode are available on dcri.org/BTE. If you have any burning questions about clinical research or healthcare, drop us a line at beyondtheendpoint@duke.edu. We'd love to address your questions in a future episode.